The Watchers, 3,500 years before the birth of Christ, in the river cities of southern Mesopotamia, someone sat down and wrote history. Not myth, not poetry, not prayer. They pressed a reed into wet clay, and in careful cuneiform strokes recorded the names, ranks, and decisions of beings they called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven came down. The texts do not describe them the way cultures describe forces of nature. Rain does not have a job title. The flood does not sit on a council. But the Anunnaki do. They have ranks. They have a chain of command. They argue, reverse decisions, and complain about their workload. And the civilization that recorded all of this, with the same administrative precision it used to track grain and cattle, was the oldest literate civilization on Earth, which means the oldest written record in human history is, before anything else, a description of beings who were not human. The Sumerian city-states were not primitive. By 3500 BC, they had writing, mathematics, irrigation agriculture, codified law, and a bureaucratic system sophisticated enough to track individual transactions across an empire. These were not people who confused the wind for a person. Their theology was specific because their observation was specific. The Anunnaki appear across their oldest texts. The Atrahasis epic, dated to roughly 1700 BC, drawing on oral traditions centuries older. The Epic of Gilgamesh, compiled around 2100 BC. The Sumerian king list, recording rulers going back tens of thousands of years before the flood. In all of these, the Anunnaki are not metaphors. They are administrators. They hold territory. According to the Atrahasis, they create humans by mixing clay with the blood of a slain divine being, specifically to perform labor the Anunnaki no longer wish to perform themselves. This is not the language of nature worship. This is the language of someone describing a management structure they observed. Harvard scholar Thorkild Jacobson, in his 1976 work The Treasures of Darkness, argued the Anunnaki began as nature spirits gradually bureaucratized by an increasingly complex civilization, that the divine administration mirrored the earthly one because humans projected their own social structures upward. It's a reasonable explanation. Samuel Noah Kramer at the University of Pennsylvania spent decades translating Sumerian texts and reached similar conclusions. But the Atrahasis presents a specific problem for that reading. In that text, the Anunnaki number around 600, divided between those stationed on Earth and those who remain in the sky, a group called the Igigi. The Igigi eventually revolt against their workload. That revolt is what triggers the creation of humans as a labor substitute. That is not a metaphor for the harvest cycle. That is a corporate restructuring narrative. The Sumerians describe the founding of their own civilization not as a gift from nature, but as a byproduct of a labor dispute among beings who had been here before them. The detail that resists every conventional explanation is buried in the Atrahasis creation sequence. The word for the clay mixed with divine blood is tit, a term carrying connotations not just of earth and mud, but of flesh and biological matter. Several serious scholars, including Kramer, noted the discomfort of the passage. It reads less like a creation myth and more like a procedure. Add to this the Apkallu, the 7 sages of Mesopotamian tradition, depicted in Assyrian palace reliefs from the reign of Ashur-nasir-pal II at Nimrud, around 865 BC. Fish-robed, eagle-headed, carrying the gods' distinctive handbag. These figures appear in cuneiform tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, dated to roughly 650 BC, described as created in the river, sent by the god Enki to transmit civilization to humanity before the Great Flood. The Apkallu are the ones who arrive with the knowledge. The Anunnaki are the ones who authorized it. And the Sumerians, the people who invented writing, used that invention first to tell us that neither civilization nor writing itself originated with them. The standard response is that ancient people naturally projected power onto the sky. That hierarchy produces divine hierarchy. That the Anunnaki are simply Sumerian kings with better press. But there's a question that answer can't quite reach. If the Anunnaki were a projection of Sumerian social structure, why did the Sumerians record that those beings created the Sumerians specifically because they, the Anunnaki, were tired? Gods invented by humans to explain human power do not, as a rule, get tired. They do not complain. They do not restructure. The Sumerians gave their creators the one quality that makes them impossible to dismiss as pure symbol. They gave them limitations. And beings with limitations are not metaphors. They are portraits. This remains one of the most contested readings in Mesopotamian archaeology. Most Sumerologists still favor Jacobson and Kramer's explanation as the leading one, not evidence of literal beings. The Shining Ones. Around 1500 BC. Though the stories themselves may be older, pulled from an oral tradition stretching back to the edge of the last ice age. The people of pre-Christian Ireland were preserving a memory their descendants would eventually write down. In the 11th century AD, in a text called the Labor Gabala Erin, the Book of Invasions. What that text records is not a pantheon. It is a history of prior occupants. Before the Gaels, before any human dynasty, Ireland was inhabited by a race called the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu. They did not emerge from the earth. They did not rise from the sea. According to the oldest versions of the account, they arrived from the north in dark clouds, bringing 4 objects with them that could not be made by human hands. And when they eventually lost Ireland to the incoming Gaels, they did not die. They withdrew into the hills, into specific hills. Hills the Irish could still point to on a map. The Tuatha Dé Danann are not described the way the Irish later described God: distant, omnipotent, invisible. They are described as neighbors with a complicated history. They lost battles, they negotiated treaties, they intermarried with humans, and left offspring in the genealogies of real Irish kings. Scholar Anne Ross, in her 1967 work Pagan Celtic Britain, argued they were deified ancestors, heroes elevated through centuries of storytelling into something approaching divinity. That's a defensible academic position, but it struggles with the specificity of the texts. The Dagda, their leader, is described in terms almost comically unglamorous: large, aged, somewhat ridiculous, dragging an enormous club, eating from a cauldron that is never empty. This is not how cultures describe metaphors for natural forces. The sun does not have a body type. The harvest does not have a personality. The Dagda has both, in embarrassing detail, which suggests the Irish were remembering someone rather than inventing someone. The 4 sacred objects that Tuatha Dé Danann brought to Ireland resist symbolic reading. The spear of Lugh, which never missed its target. The sword of Nuada, from which no one escaped once drawn. The cauldron of the Dagda, never empty. The stone of Fall, which would scream when touched by the rightful king. These are not poetic descriptions of seasons or weather. They are object descriptions with specific functions and specific owners, recorded with the same matter-of-fact precision Irish annalists used for cattle raids and dynastic marriages. The detail that pulls hardest is linguistic. The name Danu, the mother figure, at the root of the Tuatha Dé Danann, appears with striking similarity in the Sanskrit tradition, where Danu is the mother of the Danavas, a class of powerful non-human beings who preceded the current divine order and were eventually driven underground. That linguistic parallel is not universally accepted by etymologists, and that caution is worth keeping. But the structural parallel is harder to dismiss. In both traditions, a race of powerful, non-human, civilization-associated beings, descended from a mother figure sharing this root, loses a war with a succeeding order and retreats underground. That specific plot, arrival, civilization building, conflict, withdrawal into the earth, appears in Sumerian texts, in Hindu mythology, in Andean tradition, and in Irish legend. Across cultures, with no documented contact and no shared language, the Irish did not bury the Tuatha Dé Danann in abstraction. They buried them in geography. The side, the fairy mounds, are real hills, in real locations, that real Irish people continued to treat as inhabited for centuries, after Christianity officially replaced the old tradition. They did not forget where the previous occupants went. They remembered the address, and the fact that the builders of Newgrange, one of the most astronomically precise monuments in the ancient world, are associated in Irish tradition with exactly this race of skilled, luminous, non-human builders, is a connection archaeology has not yet found a comfortable way to discuss. The Nommo, somewhere around the dawn of the agricultural age, in what is now Mali, West Africa, a tradition began that the Dogon people would carry intact through more than 5,000 years of oral transmission. It survived the desiccation of the Sahara. It survived conquest, displacement, and every external disruption that touched West Africa across 50 centuries. When two French anthropologists, Marcel Grial and Germain Dieterlen, finally sat with Dogon elders in the 1930s and 40s and began writing it down, what they recorded stopped the academic world cold. The Dogon possessed detailed astronomical knowledge of the Sirius star system, specifically that Sirius had a small, dense, invisible companion star. They knew its orbital period. They described its physical properties. Sirius B, the star they were describing, cannot be seen with the naked eye. Western astronomy did not confirm its existence until 1862. The Dogon called it Potolo. They described it as the smallest and heaviest of all stars, a description matching the astrophysical reality of a white dwarf, with an accuracy that has no comfortable explanation. They stated its orbital period as 50 years. The actual period is 9 years. Grial and Dieterlen published their findings in a 1950 paper titled A Sudanese Sirius System, and later expanded the documentation in their 1965 work, Les Renards Pales. The academic response was, predictably, skepticism. Anthropologist Walter van Beek conducted his own fieldwork among the Dogon in 1991 and published a challenge in Current Anthropology, arguing the astronomical knowledge was not as widespread within the community as Grial claimed, and raising the possibility that Grial had primed his informants during the interview process. That is a serious methodological critique. It cannot be dismissed. It is, in fact, one of the most discussed cases of possible fieldwork contamination in anthropology. But it does not explain how Grial's informants, if they were confabulated a 50-year orbital period accurate to a fraction of a percent. The beings the Dogon credit with this knowledge are called the Nommo, amphibious, intelligent, humanoid from the waist up, with lower bodies resembling fish or dolphins. They arrived, the tradition says, in a spinning, noise-producing arc, descending from the direction of Sirius, entering water, and from the water transmitting their knowledge before departing. The Dogon describe multiple visits across enormous spans of time. The Nommo are not gods in any abstract sense. They are travelers with a point of origin, a vehicle, and a purpose. The fishmen. Around 290 BC, a Babylonian priest named Viracocha wrote down an account he insisted was history, not myth. A being named Oannes, with a fish body above a human body, emerged from the Persian Gulf in the earliest period of Babylonian civilization. He taught the people law, writing, agriculture, and geometry, returning to the sea each night, never eating during the day. He is described in physical terms. He has a schedule. He has a curriculum. Viracocha, writing for a skeptical Greek audience, includes the detail that Oannes consumed nothing during the hours he spent among humans. That detail appears across multiple fragmentary sources for the Viracocha account, without variation. It survived millennia of transmission unchanged. A symbol does not have a meal schedule. A metaphor for the sea does not decline lunch. Oxford scholar Stephanie Daly argues that figures like Oannes represent culture heroes elevated to divine intermediary status over centuries, that the fish costume was a priestly vestment, ritually reenacted in temple practice. The fish-robed Assyrian priests, depicted in the Nimrud reliefs around 865 BC, support this reading. There were definitely humans wearing fish costumes in ancient Mesopotamia, but the costume explanation creates a problem it doesn't solve. If Oannes was always a priest in ritual garment, why does Viracocha describe him with such specific biological anomaly? The eating detail is the crux. Priests in costumes eat. Priests performing ritual reenactments eat between ceremonies. The insistence, across multiple independent fragments, that Oannes consumed nothing during his daylight hours among humans is not a detail that serves any symbolic function. Agricultural deities eat. Water deities are associated with abundance. A being representing the gift of food and agriculture, declining to eat, is not a symbol. It is an observation. And the cuneiform tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal, describing the 7 Apkallu sages as created in the river and sent by Enki before the flood, carry the same functional description, without the fish costume framing. The Apkallu are not priests, they are the originals the priests were imitating. The Assyrian reliefs at Nimrud show them in extraordinary physical detail, some fully fish-robed, some eagle-headed, some human except for wings, carrying the distinctive handbag in one hand, a pine cone in the other, pointing at the tree of life like a technical operation. They appear in the throne rooms of Assyrian kings, carved with the same precision given to military victories and royal genealogies. These are not decorative figures. They are the beings to whom the entire edifice of Mesopotamian civilization is traced. Viracocha knew his Greek readers would find Oannes impossible. He included the dietary detail anyway, because the temple archives had it, and a scholar who changes the inconvenient details is not writing history. A being came from the water, it taught everything, it ate nothing, it left. And the civilization it founded spent 3,000 years carving its image into the walls of every throne room it built. The white god of the Andes stand at the gate of the sun in Tiwanaku, Bolivia, and look at the figure carved into its lintel. Frontal, symmetrical, rigid with authority. In each hand, a staff. From his eyes, rays, or tears, the translation remains disputed, streaming downward in identical patterns. He stands above 48 winged attendants, arranged in 3 rows. He is not Incan. The Inca who inherited this site did not build it. They found it, already ancient, already partially ruined. And they did what every culture does. When it inherits something it cannot explain, they incorporated it into their own origin story. They called him Viracocha, the instructor of the world. And they told the Spanish, when the Spanish arrived, that he had left long ago, walking westward across the Pacific, gone. The Spanish chroniclers recording Andean oral tradition after 1532 faced a problem most of them failed to recognize. The Inca told them Viracocha was white-skinned and bearded. The Spanish assumed the Inca had been primed to expect European conquerors, that the description was retrofitted after contact. Archaeologist John Rowe at UC Berkeley made this argument in careful academic form. Not without merit. Post-conquest contamination is a real and pervasive problem in Andean studies, but it doesn't account for the iconographic record. The staff god figure, frontal weeping staff carrying, appears in Chavin culture, dating to roughly 900 BC, in Wari culture, around 600 to 1000 AD, and in Tiwanaku itself. 3 separate Andean civilizations, none of them Inca, carrying the same template across more than 1,000 years of independent development. The Inca did not invent Viracocha. They received him from cultures whose names they no longer knew. The physical descriptions recorded by Pedro de Cieza de León in 1553 and Juan de Betanzos in 1551 are consistent with each other and with earlier Andean accounts. Viracocha arrived after a great flood, created the sun and moon, fashioned the first humans from stone, walked among them teaching, then departed westward across the sea, promising to return. The departure is always westward, always voluntary, always final. Thor Heyerdahl's 1947 Kon-Tiki expedition demonstrated that reed vessels could traverse the Pacific, lending at least physical plausibility to the directional tradition. But the more interesting evidence isn't the departure, it's the tears. The rays or tears streaming from the staff god's eyes appear in Chavin iconography, predating Tiwanaku by over 1,000 years, suggesting the detail was inherited, not invented by one culture. Some researchers propose those markings encode astronomical information. Specific star positions, specific times of year, which would mean the weeping face isn't an emotional portrait, it's a calendar. The detail that conquest contamination can't reach is the beard. Andean populations are characteristically beardless. The genetic expression for heavy facial hair is largely absent from pre-Columbian South American populations. That's not a controversial anthropological claim, it's a straightforward biological observation. The Inca described their creator deity with a physical characteristic that did not exist among them. Either they invented a bearded god from nothing, with no referent in their visual experience, or they were faithfully describing someone who looked different from anyone they had ever seen. Both possibilities are uncomfortable, in different ways. The Fallen One's Genesis, chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. 4 verses, embedded in the genealogy between the sons of Adam and the story of Noah. Almost invisible in the surrounding text. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Giants, heroes of old, men of renown. Then the passage ends. No explanation, no elaboration. For centuries, biblical scholars treated this as an anomalous fragment, but when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, between 1947 and 1956, one of the texts found in Cave 4 at Qumran was an Aramaic manuscript, 4Q201, one of the oldest surviving copies of the Book of Enoch, and the Book of Enoch did not treat Genesis chapter 6 as a fragment, it treated it as the summary of an entire history. First Enoch, dated to roughly 300 to 200 BC, but drawing on much older traditions, describes what Genesis compressed into 4 verses in extraordinary detail. 200 beings called Watchers, or Grigori, descended on Mount Hermon under 2 leaders, Azazel and Shemyaza. They took human wives. They had children. And then they did something the text treats as the central crime, more serious than the intermarriage, more serious than the children. They taught. Azazel taught metallurgy, working metal, making weapons. Others taught enchantments, omen reading, astronomy, cosmetics, medicine. The Book of Enoch frames this transmission of knowledge as a catastrophe, a violation of the boundary between what humans were meant to know and what they were not. The punishment is imprisonment. The Watchers are bound beneath the earth to await final judgment. Their children, the Nephilim, are destroyed in the flood. The knowledge they transmitted stays in the world, unrecalled. Scholar Margaret Barker, in her 2004 work Temple Theology, argues the Watcher tradition predates the Hebrew Bible and was deliberately suppressed in the editorial process that produced the canonical Old Testament. The presence of 4Q201 among the Dead Sea Scrolls in Aramaic, not Greek, confirms this wasn't a late import. It was already embedded in the tradition, already ancient, already considered dangerous enough to hide in caves while being excluded from canon. The Zoroastrian tradition independently describes a split within a single class of divine beings, the Ahuras and the Dievas, dividing over their relationship to humanity. The Yazidi tradition preserves Melek Taus, the peacock angel, who refused to bow before humanity, associated with both transgression and forbidden knowledge. The Vedic tradition describes the Asuras as powerful non-human beings who preceded the current divine order, driven into the underworld after conflict with the Devas. The structural pattern across every one of these traditions is identical in a way that exceeds any reasonable expectation of coincidence. A class of non-human beings crosses a boundary. The central act is knowledge transfer. The consequence is removal, imprisonment, banishment, or withdrawal. The Sumerians celebrated the Apkallu for the same act the Hebrews condemned the Watchers for committing. The Dogon honored the Nommo for what the Book of Enoch treats as an offense requiring divine punishment. Different cultures, facing the same memory, reached opposite moral conclusions. They agreed on what happened. They disagreed on whether it was good. Before the gods, the Neteru, the temple of Horus at Edfu in southern Egypt, was built between 237 and 57 B.C. But the texts carved into its walls claim to record something far older. The Edfu building texts. They describe, in careful hieroglyphic sequence, the founding of Egypt's original sacred sites. Not by pharaohs, not by the gods of the dynastic period, by beings called the Neteru, who inhabited a primeval island before the flood, before the first dynasty, before any human ruler. The word Neteru, usually translated as gods, more precisely means those who watch, or the guardians. It carries connotations of active supervision, not abstract divinity. And the Edfu texts describe them not as supernatural forces, but as builders. They came to a specific place, constructed specific structures, established the sacred geometry all later Egyptian architecture would follow. Then the flood came. Most of them died. The survivors moved on to found the next sacred site. They were not immortal. They were mortal architects with better knowledge than anyone who came after. The Turin King list, compiled under Ramesses II around 1200 BC, presents the pharaonic succession with the same administrative precision used for grain records and census data. But before the historical pharaohs, the list includes pre-dynastic rulers, the followers of Horus, and before them, beings who reigned for tens of thousands of years. Mainstream Egyptology classifies this as mythological interpolation. But the scribes who compiled the Turin King list did not, anywhere else in the document, confuse myth with administration. They were capable of the distinction. Recording the pre-dynastic beings in the same format used for historical pharaohs suggests they didn't experience it as a categorical difference. They thought they were recording earlier rulers of a different kind, not inventing fiction. The geological challenge comes from Robert Schoch at Boston University, who presented analysis of the Sphinx enclosure at a geological conference in 1992. The enclosure walls show rainfall weathering patterns consistent with a wet climate, requiring centuries of heavy precipitation. The last time Giza received that kind of rainfall was between roughly 7,000 and 10,000 BC, well before the dynastic Egyptians conventionally credited with building the Sphinx. Schoch's findings have been disputed by most Egyptologists, though the geological argument itself hasn't been definitively refuted. This remains one of the most contested fringe theories in Egyptology, not a mainstream position. Separately, Robert Bauval and Adrian Gilbert, in their 1994 work The Orion Mystery, argued the layout of the three Giza pyramids mirrors the belt stars of Orion as they appeared around 10,500 BC, a date consistent with Schoch's analysis, and with the date the Edfu texts assign to the founding of the original sacred sites. Worth noting, this convergence is frequently cited by a small, overlapping circle of alternative history authors, rather than confirmed independently across mainstream geology and Egyptology. The inventory stelae, found at Giza in 1858, dated to the 26th dynasty, claims the Great Sphinx predated the reign of Khufu, the pharaoh conventionally credited with its construction. The mainstream response is that the stele is a later forgery, or pious fiction. It may be, but it's a curious fiction that asserts the same chronological impossibility the geological and astronomical evidence independently suggests the Egyptians kept meticulous records of everything. The one record they kept imprecisely, the one account that contradicts itself and resists clean chronology, is the account of who was here before them. The Neteru are described as prior occupants with superior technical knowledge, who built the template Egyptian civilization spent 3,000 years refining. The blueprint, there is a description. It doesn't belong to one culture. It isn't the property of one scripture, one mythology, one continent, or one era. It surfaces in the oldest written records on Earth and in oral traditions that predate writing by thousands of years. It appears in the valley between the Tigris and Euphrates, in the highlands of the Andes, in the river cities of the Indus Valley, in pre-Christian Ireland, in the oral memory of the Dogon, in the Edfu building texts of Egypt, in the library of Ashurbanipal, and in 4 compressed verses of Genesis, the canonical editors clearly didn't know what to do with. Across every one of these sources, the description is not approximately similar. It is the same description: tall, luminous, associated with water or sky, or both. Arrived before civilization, transmitted its foundations, departed. The Dogon and the Babylonians are separated by a continent and 3,000 years. The Andean staff god and the Göbekli Tepe pillar figures are separated by 12,000 years and an ocean. The physical consistency is striking, but explainable, at least in theory. Tall, luminous figures appear in religious traditions because height and light are natural symbols of power. Comparative mythologist Maria Gimbutas at UCLA documented recurring symbolic systems across Bronze Age cultures with no known contact in her 1989 work, The Language of the Goddess, suggesting some iconographic inheritance runs deeper than known historical transmission. That explanation covers the broad strokes. It doesn't cover the specifics, the Dogon's 50-year orbital period for an invisible star, Oannes' documented refusal to eat, preserved across independent sources for 2,000 years, the bearded Viracocha, described by a genetically beardless population. These are not symbolic resonances, these are data points. The detail no framework in comparative mythology fully absorbs is the departure. Every other archetypal figure stays. The trickster keeps tricking. The mother keeps giving birth. The hero returns from the underworld. These are cycles, eternal recurrences, mirroring the natural patterns of seasons and generations. But the civilization-founding beings in every tradition on this list leave once and do not come back. The Anunnaki withdrew after human civilization was established. The Tuatha Dé Danann retreated into the hills. The Nommo departed after transmitting their knowledge. Viracocha walked into the Pacific and was gone. The Watchers were imprisoned beneath the earth. The Neteru dispersed after the flood. The departure is always voluntary, always complete, always mourned. The Popol Vuh of the Maya records that the beings who created the first humans grew concerned their creation might become as knowing as they were. That anxiety, expressed in almost identical terms in Genesis, in the Book of Enoch, in the Atrahasis, in the Vedic Asura myths, is the thread connecting every tradition on this list. Something came before, something transmitted knowledge, something left, and every civilization that inherited that memory spent the rest of its existence building monuments to a face it could no longer see. 8 civilizations. 8 traditions, developed independently across continents and millennia, that could not have compared notes. And yet, the description they left behind is specific, consistent on the physical details, consistent on function, consistent on timing, consistent on the knowledge transmitted, and consistent, most hauntingly, on the departure. The ancients were not speculating about powers that might exist. They were recording something they were absolutely certain had happened. They committed those records to clay, to stone, to cave wall, to oral tradition, carefully maintained across 100 generations, because the event they were describing was the most important thing that had ever happened to them. It changed what they were, it gave them everything they built. And when it ended, they spent every subsequent century trying to explain to their descendants that the world their descendants inhabited was not the original world. Something had been here first. Something had taught them everything. And something had gone. This remains one of the most contested topics in historical research, often called the ancient astronaut hypothesis, or the theory of an advanced prehistoric civilization. Most mainstream scholars reject this interpretation, arguing that the similarities across cultures come from universal human storytelling patterns, rather than a shared historical event. This video presents real archaeological and textual evidence, and the way some researchers have chosen to interpret it. The evidence is real. The interpretation is yours to weigh. If you enjoyed this, subscribe. The archive goes deeper than this video, and so does the mystery.